So the election. So this did not go well for Trump. It didn't go well for him for a variety of different reasons. So the question is, why did Trump lose? He's an incumbent. He was an incumbent. He had the advantage, and so why did he fail this time? Going into this election cycle, he was doing okay-ish, right? He wasn't extremely popular, but he had the incumbency advantage. He had a good economy. Things were going well for him. And if it wasn't for the pandemic, he probably would have won. There's always counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are when you posit an alternative future. And they tend to break apart the farther you go out or the more variables you go. They're really analytically not very useful in my opinion. There's actually was interesting early on in the pandemic, a political scientist from Georgetown, I don't remember his name, he wrote this article in the Washington Post where he says counterfactuals are something political scientists use all the time, and I wanted to email Georgetown and say remove it, revoke his doctorate, because it's something we don't do. Because counterfactuals are basically meaningless because you're positing an alternative future that you don't know how it actually would have happened, right? So if I say, what if Rome didn't fall? Well, how would I even posit that beyond just a few cursory things? So when we say if the pandemic wasn't around, would Trump probably won? Probably, right? But we can't say that with certainty, right? Um, but this was a major drag upon his campaign. So counterfactuals fall apart pretty fast, right? But we can make some judgments on it. So, but when you go beyond that, like this person who posited this article, talked about Hillary Clinton, how what she would have done in the pandemic. And the problem is he has no basis for saying that. I mean, things she would have done things differently, probably, but we don't know where any of this stuff would have been at, how she would handle it. It was such a analytically stupid argument, and I have a real problem with that and that level of analysis, just how dumb it is, to be blunt. Anyways, but why did Trump lose? Um, he failed to expand his base. Trump's base is extremely fervent for him. They love him. He really speaks to that subset of the population that really likes his the way he speaks, the way he talks about Democrats, the way his policies, and they fervently love him. And that's fine. Barack Obama had a very fervent base as well. The difference, however, is Barack Obama was able to expand that base and was able to draw people from the middle. You cannot run a campaign solely based upon a very fervent base. I mean, he was almost able to do that, but it was very difficult for him because that base can only do so much, and you need to expand to the middle. Trump, in 2016, when he was elected, I made the argument, and it's interesting as a political scientist. Political scientists are terrible at predicting things, and I always tell people, I said, when I make a prediction, it's like, this is my prediction. It might happen. Anyone who says things with certainty is being dishonest with you, and I'm right sometimes and I'm wrong sometimes. It's just the reality. But in 2016, I said that Trump would probably move back to the middle, right? He won the election in 2016, and he probably what I thought he would do was then shift to the middle, shift to be more moderate, and become much more of the people's president, right? And he never did that. He just kind of maintained his base, and he'd hold these rallies, and they would there's all this adulation for him, and it never really garnered him more support. And that combative nature was really off-putting to many people. Now, many moderates could accept that because of the economy. The economy is doing well. They're like, okay, well, he's kind of toxic, but you know not, that's a don't take it as my judgment. That's what a lot of people call him. That's not what that's not making a normative judgment about that. But they say, well, he's combative. He could be toxic, and well, I'm okay with that because the economy is doing so well. And it's easy for people to accept that. Well, here comes the pandemic, which destroyed the economy. And so with the pandemic, he had an inconsistent response. He was seen as reckless. He demeaned experts, and he actually got COVID. I think actually getting COVID was really problematic for him because it threw a chink in his armor. You know, the inconsistent response was, the federal government has no obligation to respond to any of these things. It's up to the states to actually respond in some level. In a completely purely federal aspect, right? The CDC has a role, but they can't force the states to do much anything. But the federal government has an unofficial role here because they are the best clearinghouse for information and gear and all these different things because they are the most organized in terms of just a centralized structure. He didn't do that, and that was problematic. So his response was inconsistent. He demeaned the experts, which people wanted, some level of like assurance here. He was, he gave an interview where he said he downplayed the importance of this, right? Now, if the pandemic turned out to be a month or two thing, this probably wouldn't have hurt him. But now we're still going on, numbers are rising, and that scares people. And so those things are going to hurt his campaign chances. Now, the most thing that probably hurt the most is the economy. The economy is doing better than it was a few months ago, but it's still not good. There's many people out of work. We're still in recovery. And he made a reasonable argument that this wasn't his fault. And to a large extent, it kind of wasn't, right? He can't control the pandemic to some degree. But then again, he kind of, he could have done things differently, and not passing another stimulus package was probably hurtful for him because he wanted to blame it on the Democrats and people really didn't. And he probably should have passed that stimulus package. So, that's really that's one thing that really hurt him was just mostly, I think, more than anything else, the pandemic and the economy. Now, his messaging was always problematic. Twitter, people, a lot of people really disliked just the way that he conducts himself. And, just with world leaders, with, his opponents, and it's quite off-putting. And so, but many people in his base really like that. The problem is that he already has his base voting for him, so he needs to expand that base. And then during the pandemic came the killing of George Floyd and the riots, and Trump took a very hard line on that. And again, that was divisive, and it didn't really make him amenable to the middle. And this came the George Floyd killings and the riots and the protests really brought into focus race relations, and many people, moderate people, like had a real point of reflection. And he didn't use that time to maybe moderate his tone to make himself appear to be someone to bring people together. He made it view this as a culture war, and that's really much of his rhetoric was a culture war, and that proved very problematic for him. And I mean, it also proved problematic for the Democrats as well. This equally hurt the Democrats, but it kind of hurt both sides. You have the Democrats, calling for defunding the police, all these different things, and that's quite scary to people because it sounds like they don't want policing, which is not true actually, and that's a pretty bad messaging. And Trump's response was, he was to, send in federal police agencies and all these different things. The response was hard line. Now, there's a justification for some of that at some level, but he could have used this point as a way for him to gain more support, and he didn't. What he tried to do was he tried to use the same formula he did on Clinton with Biden, and it didn't stick. The Hunter Biden emails and the laptop, no one took seriously, mostly because of the sourcing of it. The Burisma, trying to pin Burisma. I mean, this was thoroughly investigated by with the impeachment of him, which is funny enough was never really talked about this campaign, which is shocking to me, and which is probably good for Biden because he didn't talk about impeachment because it wasn't a very good win for the Democrats. I think it was a loss for them. But so he tried to do the same thing. Clinton had a lot of baggage. She bungled Benghazi severely. And you'll listen in my lecture 14 about why Hillary Clinton was a terrible candidate for a variety of reasons. And the problem with Clinton too was that her long history, and then there was the meeting with the Attorney General Loretta Lynch on the tarmac. with Bill Clinton right before the election. There's a lot of things that played into his favor about demonizing Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton was not very popular, and we can go into that as well. But she tried to do the same thing with Biden, and no one took it seriously except his own base. The Biden emails, I mean, no law enforcement agency has taken it up really. Uh, there's a lot of questions about the veracity of them, if and it it just didn't really paint a picture of any of this that's really stuck against Biden. And so Trump, he tried to paint Joe Biden as um, as corrupt, and it really didn't stick. And the problem is, the probably thing he could have got Joe Biden on was his extremely awkwardness and borderline sexual harassment of women in politics. And there's our own state assembly person said Joe Biden sniffed her hair, right? Trump really didn't have a leg to stand on because of his own sexual misconduct charges or allegations. And so you basically have two white men who both have issues with sexual harassment, and so none of them can really use it against one another. Um, anyways, the other big piece was that Trump really didn't pass any legislation, any signature legislation. He passed some criminal justice reform, which is good. It was bipartisan. He passed the tax cut, but everything else he had to do via executive order, and he really didn't get he really didn't have much of to go on other than cultural war, immigration, and all these other things that he could do via executive order, but not actually he didn't really pass much of anything. He wanted to repeal and replace Obamacare, but the problem is they never came with an alternative. It was, oh, we should get rid of this. And Obamacare is a funny thing because it's, in one respect, it's very unpopular. It is unpopular, but you have to provide a viable alternative. And it is very popular. So this is where the thing, people don't like it in one respect, but they also realize that if you threaten to take it away, they do like it. And so it's a very tricky thing to deal with. So, um, this all poses problems for Trump. Now, he's also his own worst enemy. He provided the best foil for the Democrats they could possibly imagine. Joe Biden wasn't exactly a very strong candidate. He wasn't a bad candidate. He wasn't a strong candidate, arguably, and so he was a safe candidate for the Democrats. And so Trump, though, he was so inflammatory that people got out to vote. People who didn't like Trump really don't like him, and so that created a massive amount of money, a massive amount of organization, a massive amount of get out the votes, and so people came out in droves. We have to see this highest number of votes ever, in many years. Joe Biden got the most votes of any president in all of history. And Trump would come in number two if he had won, right? Or come number two if he had won. And so, but that would not have happened if this had been someone else, right? In theory, right? Because Trump was so inflammatory, and so he did that. He did all this inflammatory stuff to rile up his base, but that came out to hurt him because it provided this foil for which Democrats could use for fundraising and all different things. That being said, the amount of money that Democrats put into this race was immense, and they barely unseated him. And that poses a very troubling problem for them. That if they can't unseat, if they have all this money to unseat someone who's relatively unpopular during a pandemic and a recession, they got problems. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So there's layers upon layers about why Trump lost. I'll probably add more to this as I think about this more. I've had a few days to think about this, and probably more will come back out, and I'll write more, and I'll probably cover this again in lecture 14. So, anyways. So why Biden won? Why did Biden win? He's not Trump. I have a hard time believing people voted for him, and I mean I could be wrong. They really liked Biden. Now he's not a bad candidate, but he's fairly vanilla. He has a lot of baggage associated with him, but he's consistent, he's predictable, and he's a moderate. Those are all things that Trump is not. And that's what a lot of people wanted. Now we're in this time of great political and social turmoil, and you have someone, people don't want to wake up in the morning and think, oh, what's the president going to do? I want, they want to wake up and say, okay, well, this is fairly consistent. And so that's what Biden is. This poses a problem for Biden, though. Since people really didn't vote for him, they voted against him. What does that mean for his mandate? And so he has a mandate, right? I mean, so a mandate is what comes from the people, right? Say, okay, well, say this is what the people I was elected. This is what they wanted me to do. So I'm going to do it, right? The problem is every president, every congressperson say, I have a mandate. They're never not going to say that, right? Because that would be undercutting themselves. At the same time, Biden knows he barely won. He knows that many people did not vote for him. And he knows that that they didn't really vote for him. They probably voted against Trump. And at least a lot of them did. Some people did. I'm not saying they didn't. And so that poses a problem for him. And so he needs to make sure that make sure that the policies passes are ones that are not too extreme. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. And so yeah, so that's really why he won. Trump lost because of a lot of reasons. Biden played a very consistent way. He was able to be basically, he let Trump just beat Trump, and that played in his favor. Biden has a lot of gaffes. He has a lot of gaffes, and he was still able to pull that out. He was still able to pull this out. And so I would argue that this is mostly Trump's race to lose, and he did. Now the votes. Biden won where he needed to, but he did not outperform like Trump in the ways people thought he would. So what does this mean for Biden? Like I said before, he has a mandate. He'll claim he has a mandate, but he doesn't really have one. I mean, he kind of does, right? And so it's not saying he shouldn't pursue his policies. He certainly should. That's his job. But he has to temper them. So the right, sorry, the political left, the progressive wing, is probably not going to get everything they want. So he's going to have to tone it down. He's going to find things that are bipartisan. He's going to find things that are popular amongst the country writ large. And so that's going to be difficult for him because you have the political progressive wing of the party saying, hey, you should do all these different things. So now the Democrats, since they control the presidency, are going to fight amongst themselves. And that's going to be difficult for them because they're going to want certain things. Now, we'll talk about the nature of Congress in a minute, but the structure of Congress. But so this is all going to be very problematic for Biden because, if he won, say, 90% of the vote, some insane number, it would be clearly based upon his policies, or more based upon his policies. And then you can say, okay, well, I have the political capital to do these. But say, for example, he goes and passes gun control. That's going to cost him, right? It's going to cost him votes. And so that is going to cost him, political capital. And so he can try to do that, but again, unless there's a extremely popular momentum to get this stuff done, he's going to have to play it safe. Now, this means Biden is relatively weak. No, I mean, as was Trump was. Trump was extremely weak going into office because he didn't win the popular vote, and he barely won. So Trump never got a honeymoon period, which is his own doing. Biden probably will, but it's not going to be as generous as that. The honeymoon period is a period of time which the president-elect or the new president gets in office, and people have no expectation. They don't know what he's done. He hasn't done anything yet, so they give him so his poll numbers are artificially high, and this allows him to do some certain things right away. And what Biden's already outlined is that he's going to do all these executive orders because Trump basically legislated got his policies passed through executive order, which means they can get done through executive order. So he probably should have endeavored more to get them passed legislatively, right? So Biden will get on. Now he has a long history in politics, which he'll use, and I don't think that will detract from his honeymoon period. But he will get one, and then he'll get some time, which people will give him the benefit of the doubt. That will end, and whether or not he's able to build upon his popularity is in question, right? He's already going in with a lot of the country that's unhappy. Trump seeded lots of doubts about the election, and those are many people believe that. And so that's a problem for him. Now, the poll numbers were wrong again. I was right. Yay, I was right. And I say that kind of jokingly. Um, Going into the election, going into this election, as I said over and over again, we just don't know. There's too many variables. It's impossible to predict with so many variables. Now, I'm the first to admit to say, hey, I was wrong here. I was right here. And I try really hard to make sure to say when I'm wrong, I'll admit it. And so, it's as a political scientist, this is not the physical sciences where I can say, hey, this atom should behave like this. When I mix these two chemicals together, this should happen, right? You can't. It's hard to make those level of predictions because of agency and just because of the immense chaotic nature of politics. And so you can make some assertions, and sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. And you and so when out, but sometimes they're more solid than others. And I think this time I looked at the data. I said, look at all the variables at play. Look at all that's happening. There's just too much at play. We just cannot understand, especially Donald Trump, given his mercurial nature. And so I was right. The numbers were wrong. They were going to be wrong. There was more support for Trump. It wasn't enough for him to win the election, but it was much closer than it should have been. Sorry, it was much closer than we thought it was going to be. Sorry. The elections, the way we run elections have changed forever, right? And mail-in voting was a thing, right? The expansion of mail-in voting was done thoroughly, and this will probably maintain. The level of engagement probably is unsustainable. We probably won't see the same numbers next year or the following years, and whatnot. So this was actually very problematic for the Democrats. They need to maintain this level of engagement. They probably can't maintain that level, so that's going to prove very problematic for them. Now, because of the nature of the voting, the mail-in votes, that's why we saw Biden do better as time went on. Trump kind of undercut himself. Trump said, don't, he kept on stating doubts about mail-in voting, and which meant that his supporters didn't vote by mail. And so therefore the later votes counts, which are all mail-in votes, were going to be counted, we're going to be predominantly for Biden. And so that's why we saw the shift overnight and shift over time to Biden taking Pennsylvania. There should be nothing shocking about that. Is there evidence of fraud? No, there's not. Not overtly, right? And does that mean there was no fraud, however? No, it doesn't. There's certainly possibility of fraud. Now, the evidence cited online, you see a whole people say, oh, there's evidence on Twitter all over the place. And so there's few, if anything, actionable. And what we have are people posting things on the internet that are either innocuous but made to look bad, an anomaly, or something questionable. I'm not saying there was no fraud. We don't know right now, right? And that's why Trump's bringing lawsuits. But right now, as we see it, there's no real evidence, right, of like mass voter fraud. People, and and so you can point this all this stuff as well. This what happened here. This computer system, blah blah blah. This vote was found here. Yes, but the problem with that is anomalies happen. That's the nature of elections. I mean, when you have 170 million, 140 million people vote, you're going to have problems, right? You're going to have errors. The question is, were those enough to change the outcome, and to what extent were those, and are they out of the norm? You need a baseline then. Well, look at previous years. Are the error rates, are the problematic rates the same, right? Look at 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, all these different times. And if they're relatively the same, then you don't have really much that we can be concerned about, right? And the other things you need to look at is the other thing to look at is the counties and the states audit their elections, and they're usually done in a bipartisan fashion. If Trump was really concerned about this, he could have pressured the state parties. He could have launched his own investigations before. He had the ability to launch investigations. In 2016, after he was elected, he formed a voter integrity commission to look into voter fraud. He disbanded that commission before it was even did its investigation. Why didn't he have that commission do its job? The argument is, oh well, they wouldn't have been able to get access to the information. That's complete rubbish. Of course, they could have accessed information. They could. There's the Freedom of Information Act. They could subpoena the information. Whole host of things they could have done. The state level parties could have helped them. There's all types of things that they could have done to get the information. They would have found ways around that. Well, they could put light to what's happening, and they could potentially have ameliorated this quote unquote fraud that he claims it has happened. And so the idea that this fraud happened, there's nothing he could do about it, is utter rubbish. There's lots he could have done about it, but he chose not to do it until now, and which is confusing, right? Why would you wait until you've lost the election? And so again, and then state level parties, both Republican and Democrats, control these processes, and they have all pointed, say, hey, there's things, we audit this stuff. Now there are anomalies. There are things that should be investigated, and Trump has changed his tone to say, well, all legal votes should count. He's right. All legal votes should be counted, right? And so the question is then, can Trump sue? Absolutely, that's his right. If he feels some impropriety has happened, then he should be able to do so. Should he sue? Yes, absolutely. He should sue if he feels something has been done that's improper, right? Now, there's no evidence right now of anything improper. There's some anomalies. There are things that should beg questions, and they should be investigated. Absolutely, I'm all for that. And so I think that's really important. Now, what Biden should do now, because what's happened now is that people who will not accept the results, and that's a problem. And Trump has seeded this level of doubt. And if there were problems, then this needs to be exposed and made known. What Biden should do is have a commission, right, that audits all the elections and could produce a report. And it should root out any evidence of fraud and report upon that. And he should make this known to everyone. And this should be done in a way that assuages the fears that the right has. And so this should be done at a national level and be done at the state level as well. Now, normatively, he shouldn't have to do this at one level, because if there's no evidence, then why would he do this? It doesn't matter. If this is a pragmatic problem. If people are really fearful of fraud, then this is something he should do just to assuage those fears, and that would make his presidency stronger. Now, what I find interesting is actually something that I've never really thought about until now. Has the election been decided? No, it hasn't actually. What has happened is the Associated Press has decided the election, has projected the winner. The states have not certified the election. That's something they'll do over the next few weeks, which means they'll look at the rules, audit them, they'll make sure everything's all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, right? And then they'll certify it. So Biden technically hasn't won yet. They project him to be the winner. Now I find that very bizarre, however, right? Because as I thought about this, NPR and various news agencies said that Biden has won, and I thought about it for a long time, like, well, he really hasn't. What we have is a news agency, not a government entity, say that he's won. And if Trump doesn't believe the election is decided yet, in my opinion, they actually shouldn't say that, because the Associated Press has made projections. They don't have the hard data, and so it's really up to the states. So as I thought about, they probably should never do this in theory, right? Now, so this is an important point. I think it should be made. And Trump is right in this respect. I do agree with him that, this is something he has not lost yet, and he's not, technically, and he needs to, he's projected to lose. He probably will lose, but this is not a government agency, and perhaps we should wait until the election has been certified before we start making decisions. No, I understand the reason why they don't do that, because Biden wants to make transition. People want certainty. They don't want to wait. I understand that, but it is, to me, it's problematic, right? Especially in an election where Trump wants to contest it. Well, that's his right, and if he believes something proper has happened, then he should be able to do so. To start moving forward before the election is certified, to me, is improper. But it was probably improper in 2016, 2012, and 2008, and 2004, and 2000, right? It's a bizarre thing, and so as I thought about it, I'm like, wow, I never thought about the Associated Press. This is, we should probably wait till the election's actually been certified, right? Anyways, Uh, so Biden, I strongly believe that Biden should audit the election process and prove, if that that either there's any significant level of fraud, or there's no fraud, or if there might be fraud, right? And that if there is, then that's a problem. It's a massive problem, right? But if he wants to bring the country together, then that's something I think he really should do. Not because whether there is or not. It's more of a question of pragmatic politics of like, hey, he has 47, 48% of the people who are probably pretty upset right now, and they need to be assuaged. Um, Now, Trump can sue. You know, will Trump succeed? Probably not. It's Each state has their own election laws, and so Trump was going to have to sue and show that somehow these laws are violated. And again, there's no evidence right now of massive voter fraud, so it's going to be very difficult for him to prove that. What happens if he does succeed? Some states might go back to him if it's certified, and we could have a contested election in theory, but that's probably not going to happen. Will the Supreme Court step in? Probably not. What as it did in 2000. It comes down to each individual state's election laws, and so they're going to act consistently with each state's laws. And so you might see one ruling go one way for Trump in one state, but not the way in another state because of the way the laws are written. Okay, so what about the down ballot? The senator, the Senate elections, the state house elections, the house elections, right? The Democrats severely underperformed, like severely underperformed. So the Democrats grossly underperformed, right? So we expected this massive blue wave. In 2018, we had this massive net blue wave, right? Democrats elected in droves. They retook the House. They made some gains in the Senate, some minor gains, but we expected them to do much, much better than they did, and they did not. So if I was a Democrat right now, if I was a Democrat strategist, I would be very, very worried. They had them on NPR yesterday when I was listening to NPR, and it was funny listening to them because they all try to spin this in a very positive light, and that's their job, right? It's their job to spin things in the positive light as they can. They really have something to think about, right? Um, Donald Trump was the best get out the vote tool they've ever had, and they still lost ground in the House, and they might take the Senate, but probably not. And this was a good election map year for them, and so this is very much a problem for them. They did make some states competitive, but what's going to happen when Donald Trump's not on the ballot? And so this poses a massive problem for Democrats. And I would argue that the party shifting to the left is going to hurt them. And as I've argued for the Republicans as well, the Republicans will have to reinvent themselves now. And Donald Trump's out of office. Trumpism probably will die now, and they'll have to reinvent themselves. And what this election shows them is the route by which they can do so. Um, you know, so some states will become more competitive. We are seeing a realignment of the parties, I would argue. I've argued that for a while now. Now, whether I'm right or right, we'll see in 20, 30 years, right? And we're also seeing shifting demographics. The suburbs are now more competitive for the Democrats. Whether they maintain so is questionable, right? It's hard to make predictions about how things are going to play out now that Donald Trump is probably out of office because, well, he's no longer there. So now the Democrats have a more normalized situation, and this is going to be problematic for them. So they need to really, rethink what their strategy is. Right now, why did they underperform? I would argue messaging. Right. Um, they really you know, the appearance of them, of the protests, were problematic. Now, I'm not saying the protests themselves are problematic, right? The protests were this summer, but the argument of defunding the police, then you have, very vocal members of the progressive wing, pushing the party to the left, and that's going to dissuade people. And you know, because they really want the stability. They don't want to re-envision all of policing. They don't want to envision all of um the our economy, right? And so that rhetoric is very problematic. The same way that rhetoric for the extreme right is troubling, right? And so there's really this push for the middle. I think that's really what's hurting both parties. Um, and so the Democrats need to rethink that. They also need to rethink some of the groups that they've actually taken for granted. African American men, Latinx members, right? Because the Republicans did better than expected in those, right? We saw a wave of women get elected by Republican women, right? They did much better with Latinx members or certain Hispanic groups, right? Not all, and it was differentiated, right? But also African American males, right? They did better, and so the Democrats probably need to change their messaging, right? They need to actually target those groups and say, hey, we're doing something for you, right? The fact that the Republicans were able to make ground in those two groups is very telling. Now, I was wrong. I thought that Trumpism would push the Republican Party away from Latinx or Hispanic um, groups for years and years to come. I thought that was going to take the Republicans years to recover from that. I was wrong, at least in this respect. They voted for Republicans in much higher numbers. Part of that was Joe Biden. Part of it was policies. Part of it is that they traditionally are more conservative actually in their values. Right. So the Democrats are going to have to rethink their message, as are Republicans. Republicans are now going to have to rethink what the Republican Party is. It's no longer the party of Trump. It's going to be the party of something else, right? And so, what that becomes is going to be a question, right? So that's going to be a debate within each party. How do they respond to this, right? Um, and so with the Democrats, they have Biden as the head now. He's the head of the party, and so they'll have to figure a way, a way in which they can message. Now he is a moderate, which helps them, right? If this was Bernie Sanders, that it'd be much more difficult for them because Bernie Sanders is much more left leaning. Now the Senate is still at play. So there'll be runoffs in Georgia. Whether or not the Democrats take those, it's hard to say. You're going to see a massive influx of funding, massive. But my guess is it's going to play better for the Republicans because people probably want a divided government because they do not want one party controlling all things. The idea that there would be any of the filibuster, all these different things the Democrats wanted, those are going to be unpopular. People do not want these massive changes and don't want vitriol anymore. At least that's my argument, right? I could be wrong. Um, the House is still in the Democrats' hand, but they lost seats, and that is pretty damaging to them. The House is run by almost purely majoritarian rules, and so it's not going to hurt them in terms of passing policy or not passing policy, but it's going to hurt some of the progressive wing, right? The what they call the squad or whatever it is. They're probably not going to get as much attention. It might have people in the problem solver caucus, which are Republicans and Democrats, who strive to work together to to have more say. And our own Susie Lee and Amadei from Northern Nevada are part of that caucus, right? They really want to work across the aisle and actually solve things and work in bipartisan fashion. They might get some, they might not. It's hard to say, but I mean I messaged one of your colleagues in the class. We messaged back and forth about just kind of the vitriol about politics and um, just understanding the others. And you've heard me say my approach to the course is that we have understanding, right? I don't want you to agree with one another, but I want you to understand there's two ways to look at it. There's many different ways to look at things. And I made the argument that I think this is a burgeoning kind of way in which people are viewing things because of all the vitriol. And so hopefully the problem solvers might become more important. So that's my take on the election in 40 minutes, 41 minutes. Thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. In 2016, I remember I was teaching this course in person, and I remember, um, my left-leaning students would come. They came in at the election, and they thanked me because they're like, oh, thank you, because if I hadn't taken this course, I didn't realize the president is so not very powerful. And I'm like, yeah, the president is not very powerful. And if you're, a Trump supporter and you're upset, the president is not all powerful, and Joe Biden can't do whatever all the things that he wants to do. If you're a Biden supporter, you should be happy, right? You should be elated, right? But he can't do all the things he wants to do, and because we have a government that is responsible to the people and does not purely majoritarian rule. And we'll see if how the Senate plays, but this is elections have winners and losers, and the republic will go on, and this is you know nothing cataclysmic will happen from this. And so it's kind of my point. So I'll talk to you all next week. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.